Sure. Okay. Hi, I'm JP LeBreton, and I'm 41, I guess. And I have worked in the game industry for about 20 years now. I started off modding games in the 90s and got a job kind of on the basis of that. And I worked at a studio that recently closed down called Human Head Studios in Madison, Wisconsin at the beginning of my career. And then I moved to Boston and I worked at Irrational Games on the first BioShock. And then I moved out to California and helped start a studio called 2K Marin that made the second BioShock game. And then I worked as a designer at Double Fine for a few years. And then I was independent for a little while. And yeah, that about brings us up to the present. I am working at a game studio. And yeah, doing independent projects in my spare time. So yeah.
Cool. Thanks for that. So, I don't know, because I had been sort of submerged for about a year working on a book and have been shaking off the rust a bit, getting back to doing original interviews instead of posting from the older archives through the years. And I know there's a kind of shorthand when sort of talking about quote-unquote the industry and issues in the industry. And something I'm always trying to understand when I talk to people who work in the space is, because I feel a bit like an outsider myself, is people often talk about how bad things are, and they point to different areas or different issues, but I can never tell, like, are people just always giving me, like, the worst case scenarios? Like, are these the outlier cases? Because it feels like, at least for me, like I hear about a clothesline of problems that seem to have been problems for more than a decade at this point, and so I guess it's sort of a two-part question for you, which is like, we emailed a bit about how bad things are. Why do these problems seem to keep persisting, and why don't they seem to ever shift? Or is it just my sense as an outsider and it's skewed?
Well, I think it's because they're systemic problems. They are part of the system itself rather than just this random little bad thing that happens and then goes away.
Yeah.
And so I think, you have to engage in systemic analysis to understand why bad things keep happening, why things don't seem to get better, and all that. And that takes you, that's a pretty deep topic. You can follow that pretty deep into learning about the industry and, hearing about, following it and thinking about your own experiences. Mm-hmm. And, and then once you're into it, it does kind of become this all-encompassing, this surrounding kind of feeling. It's like following politics outside the industry as well. You look at just the broad trends of things happening in the world, and there's very understandably a lot of despair around that. Yeah,
I mean, you had said that things are. I guess I'm just going to quote back to you if that's not too weird from your email. You had said that things are really, really bad for smaller creators, and consolidation has been rampant, and gigs are scarce, and the long downward sales trend seems to continue, and many take day jobs. And so, what is sort of the next lowest rung that people in that pool are kind of worried is about to give out? And I'm also curious if the average person into games is even aware that these are things people who make their games are even worrying about.
Well, one caveat: I am not an independent developer in the sense of being a person who owns a studio or an individual practice who I don't try to make money off of my independent work.
Yeah.
So I don't want to come across as speaking for the people who are out there doing that still.
Yeah.
But that said, that was me at one point, and certainly a lot of people I know are still at that, or they were at it and they had to give up. So, you were asking what's is there another level down from where we are right now? And
I mean, I asked that because that's in my camp. That's sort of the thing that just talking with friends who are writers or hopeful writers, they have this sense. This has become an increased topic of conversation in the last few months. there's this feeling that like not only are like jobs going away, but it feels like careers are going away. And I don't think that that's like, because I agree these are like systemic issues. I don't think that's distinctly uniquely true of like journalism and writing. I don't think it's like ever been a great time to be a writer or a journalist unless you're like one
Sure.
of those sort of
Yeah.
I think even for like the celebrity personality journalists, they I don't think things are like they have it that much better. It's just that their work gets that much more read.
Yeah.
So I mean, like when I talk with other writers, I'm always like, well, what is this a bigger pattern of? And I mean, I guess I don't want to start this off with a bunch of despair, but I'm curious because that's something I haven't really heard much about. Are there similar conversations happening among quote unquote smaller creators that you know? Is there a ground that people are worried is about to give out?
I my ability to forecast the future here is
Sure.
going to be somewhat limited. I think one way to understand what's happening right now and how things might go is to understand that we live in an age of platforms. And that's something that I think journalists and game developers and a lot of other people doing a lot of other kinds of labor have in common. I think platforms, as they were introduced, I guess it's the 2020s now, so not last decade, but the decade before, starting with the App Store, but even things like eBay and, so there are these platforms, and a majority of them are for-profit. These are like edifices of software and policy and financial transactions that exist to generate profit for the platform holder. This is a familiar setup. We all kind of partake in these in one way or the other, just by, installing something on our phone or buying a game or listening to some music, whatever. And I think that dynamic drives the nature of labor to survive in certain ways. And I think it makes it kind of, these platforms are sort of like, they're kind of the engines by which a lot of things happen. And, when I think about a person's predicament who's working in that and they don't have hardly any power themselves, I think one thing that's generally true of these platforms is that they are concentrators of attention and labor and capital.
Yeah.
So the end effect for just an ordinary person who's like, okay, I guess I want to drive a taxi, or I want to, put a song on the internet, or I want to make money doing some writing or something, is that, they have to, their entire survival is negotiated with these platforms, to whom we're kind of just like ants, just working away. And so, what I worry is that creative work, writing, game development, etc., is going to become, I think one effect of these platforms is that they devalue part of the way that they are able to do what they do is that they devalue and kind of commodify, and I don't know what the adjective form of it, but it makes this labor like fungible. It makes our labor fungible and interchangeable.
Yeah.
So and I don't think anybody was sitting in a conference room and said, let's devalue, we're a games marketplace, let's devalue games. But I do think that that's what happened, because they fundamentally kind of had like incentives to do that. And so, and so when I hear about, independent friends and stuff lamenting like, how their game has done or what they're working on next and all that, I think devaluation is a pretty strong context to, it looms large. And I think it's also absolutely true in journalism, because that's something that clearly had a certain value to society, a generally agreed upon value to society like 40 or so years ago. And now it is not valued in that same way. And yeah, and that got me kind of thinking about the dynamics of what does it mean for something to be devalued? I think when something is devalued, you don't care about who made it. It just you don't care about where it comes from, and you don't care about any ideology behind its creation. Not that everything needs to explicitly declare or espouse its ideology, but every work, fiction, nonfiction, whatever, every work does have ideology behind it, no matter how frivolous it might seem, and it usually does matter on some level. But anyway, yeah, those are some attributes of devalued games, devalued journalism, music, etc. And so I think the longer that continues, you can imagine games just becoming a kind of toothpaste that just sort of emerges from a tube somewhere, and you use a little bit of it, and
yeah,
and then you've consumed what you need to for the day, and then you're interacting with a company. There's a single company that you know about and have a relationship with that you get all of this culture, journalism, whatever from. Yeah. And creators don't really have a role or a face or anything in that kind of era. And so, it starts to become very similar to gig economy work at that point, where, you're just, you're this serf who, depends on this platform for your survival.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I didn't mean to. I mean, I guess we can continue following this thread, but I was just thinking, I don't know what role perceived stigma or stigmas play in sort of wriggling free from this sort of devaluation, because I do know. I have heard from many of the people I've talked to over the last few years, more in the sort of player world than in the creator world, that they haven't articulated as such, but they talk about video games as though they come from a faucet, at the side of their house or something, and they just seem very sort of disconnected from it. I guess that's a certain sort of stigma, but I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say here. I guess I'm sort of processing thoughts out loud at you. I don't know if you have any kind of reaction to that, or I'm sure that's something that you're pretty well aware of if you're on the creator side of things. That's a very real thing that's already starting to happen, if not started to happen a while ago.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. I think the rise of subscription services are a very big driver of that. And I don't think it's going to have a good effect on the medium long term. I think it does all those things about, that I said about devaluation. You don't have a relationship with a creator necessarily. You didn't, when you hear about a creative work and then you seek it out and you learn about it and then you decide that it's something that you want to experience and then you pay that creator money for it. Or you support them in any way. You sort of recognize and respect their labor. I think that's an entirely different kind of relationship that you have to that. And I think anything that threatens that, and I absolutely consider, these subscription services where, on the back end, the platform holder approaches creators and says, do you want to be part of our subscription service? We'll give you a flat fee, basically. We'll give you a fee based on some pretty dubious metric, like how long people played your game, and you can immediately see how some games suffer from that more than other types of games, and all the dark patterns that emerge when there's that kind of incentive structure. Yeah, and then, and so developers are like, well, I could try my luck on the general marketplace and see how many sales I can get, or I could take this buyout from a subscription service that's offering me a good sum up front. And, and then on the, and developers, maybe sometimes that math adds up to them. But I think with all of this platform stuff and just with the dynamics of capital and society in general today, you have to look at what's not being measured. You have to look at the hidden costs. because that's kind of what modern capitalism is all about, is hiding costs. You know, we have the situation right now because we've hidden the costs of environmental destruction. You know, those don't show up on the Dow Jones or whatever, but they are very real. And, you know, by building a system that doesn't acknowledge them, we've basically, you know, put ourselves on a really bad path. And so I think there's a similar situation where something seems like it's making money. You know, these platforms came about, you know, with the App Store and so on and so on. And it, you know, even during the boom years, you know, for indie games, let's say, quote unquote, 2012, 2013, it seemed like there was a lot of money. There were these success stories, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah. And, you know, and so maybe there was that period, you know, and you look at like, well, how many people were actually benefiting from that golden age? You know, who was benefiting from it, et cetera. And then inevitably, you know, within the next couple of years, you saw a devaluation, and, you know, a lot of people that had previously benefited started to lose out on it, and people who had never even gotten to ride that train, you know, of course, it was put hopelessly out of reach. But then the platform holders did absolutely benefit, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, so.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that it feels like 1,000 years ago now, but I do remember. I mean, you're talking about like the like Super Meat Boy era, right? Like.
Yeah, from about 2008 until 2013, I would say.
Yeah.
And then 2014 was the year that it really started to drop off, and like some of that first wave of indie successes like released their second games and they didn't do as well,
right.
Or, you know, people who were kind of coming late to the party, like, you know, did something, you know, and I always try to, you know, assess like, you know, like, I don't think people suddenly got way worse at making video games in 2014 and onward. I think the market changed.
Yeah.
And, you know, it really lays bare like how the market affects, you know, everything that, you know, it kind of matters more than whether you are a talented, thoughtful game developer. Right. And that I think is super dismaying, you know, because people their second game or their first game was just as good, but it, you know, they still had to give up and take a day job or something.
Yeah. I mean, I remember that era, and there was that article about like the quote unquote indie game millionaires or whatever. And I think that like all the people who were featured in that article were all people who were on these kind of services that you were talking about. There was nobody like just off on their own, you know, like operating on their own. And so, yeah, it's weird because that's sort of like, we're kind of like the fish in the water, you know, we're not really aware that like, oh, this is maybe an issue, the stuff that we're all breathing in together. But so if you're talking about things not being measured in games, what else would you sort of like to see? Because I assume this is part of what you were talking about when you said you wanted to talk about like the influence of capital on games, and I wanted to talk to you about like what other facets of that do you wish that like was discussed more, or towards what sort of understanding or solutions, if there are any. But now that we're talking about it, I'm also curious, like, well, who should be doing this measuring? Is it everybody? Is it like media? Is it games people themselves? I feel like it's everybody.
Yeah, I mean, you know, behind the act of measurement, there is always a value system. And the reason that we have a world that only seems to care about capital expansion is that the value systems of the people driving that and benefiting from it and thus perpetuating it are people who only care about money. That is the sole determiner of the value of human existence and society. And so, I totally agree that I think we need solidarity between creators of video games and press and players of video games, just people who support the medium. Yeah. I think because together we all value different things, but you know there's a broad overlap. You know, because there's a lot of press who went on to become developers. Everybody who played games. You know, everybody who develops games generally played games before they became a developer and all that. So, yeah, and I think part of the answer is that we can't wait around for these companies, these platform holders, to suddenly develop a conscience, and figure out that, like, oh, actually, we've been exploiting all these people this whole time and devaluing this medium that we purport to be custodians of. We can't expect that to happen because ultimately those are for-profit companies, and they're never going to do, they don't have the same values as us, and they never really will. So I think we need to build outside power. I think we need to build our own platforms and our own technologies. And we need to establish, in the broader public consciousness, different aesthetics of what is interesting and valuable about our medium, what the possibilities of the medium are.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of different directions that can take, and I don't think they all need to agree. But I think, and I think we need to build platforms that have kind of a fundamentally different incentive structure, going right down to having platforms that aren't for profit. I mean, I don't know if itch.io considers itself a nonprofit or whatever. I'm sure if they suddenly started making a lot of money, they would, they wouldn't say no to that, and we would be able to put that to good use. But I do think that Itch is one example of something that is working within the framework of capitalism but with a different value system towards pretty different goals. And I think it's having a very different effect. And I think building things like that and supporting them and developing and building communities around, the different things that people are making, I think that's super important. Because I think eventually the cultural power of those things can grow to rival any institution that is, built around and for profit.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, this is, I guess, the side of the aisle I come from, so you may not have a strong opinion about it. I have my own opinions about it. How do you think media could be doing a better job of, offering solidarity or shining a spotlight on certain things that could make that more possible, or at least more plausible?
Yeah, I have a ton of opinions about it. I think media would do well to always consider what ideologies they are normalizing, tacitly approving of, etc., when they cover something. When a big outlet covers a console launch event, or when it goes to E3 and takes part in like one of the big press events where everybody claps for the new products that are being announced and stuff, I think it is an important part of media's mission to inform the public, to talk about the ideas behind what's being espoused, because I think for decades, and I think they were complicit in helping build platform holders' power, because they benefited from it, because they could be the ones who have access to that, and they can kind of be like who interprets the will of the platform holders for the public. I think that ultimately also like kind of sets them up, and this is probably something that's part of the discourse around a lot of forms of journalism and certainly in politics. I think journalists, one way that journalists can devalue what they do is by being just sort of a mouthpiece for, the ideology, the holders, the power centers that they're reporting on. When you just repeat a press release, you're sowing the seeds of your own demise down the line, because eventually those platform holders realize that actually we don't really need journalists. We can just use these platforms that in many cases we ourselves have built to just reach gigantic audiences. And the idea of, a journalist having to like interpret anything that we're saying just completely goes out of the loop. And that's good for us, the platform holders, because we can more reliably and effectively reach people with our message And we don't need to worry about, this peanut gallery of like adversarial journalists who have their own agenda and their own commentary on it, and they think they're So I think that's super important, and I think it's led to what we have now is a situation where, a lot of press outlets, they talk about, the new consoles are coming out. Oh, are they going to be more powerful than the last ones? And what is that going to make possible? And, that's basically the game. That's basically the world that we're living in, that these companies have created for us. And and it doesn't actually reflect the reality of a creative medium, and we don't have to accept it. This idea that came about, that got going at the beginning of the 90s, that hardware power is how a medium moves forward. And like technology makes new things possible. And so the two or three companies on the face of this earth that can create new technology, they are the real bottlenecks of progress and whatever. And it gets conflated with all of this like creative stuff about how like with better technology, you can, like tell better stories and, elucidate more emotions out of people,
Yeah.
And we don't have to accept any of that. And in fact, we should be just criticizing it and tearing it down and building alternative value systems and aesthetics and platforms that show that that's not the only way to be.
I mean, my sense of it is that sort of shifting around the peanut gallery has sort of already begun a while ago, and I know a lot of writers who are upset about publishers favoring YouTubers, for example, or giving them the exclusives that used to go to print media people. So that's already sort of started to happen, and then like I wonder how much of that, like, because that was something else I wanted to talk to you about, was just with these the new generation or whatever coming later this year. Like I wonder how much of that is like just people younger coming up, just sort of parroting what came before, not realizing like, but then also like those publications not really being receptive to being critical, and so like we always wind up getting what we've always got, because for some people that's like a dream come true, and also for others in a bigger way it's just the path of least resistance. But I mean, you put it a really good way about like the Blood on the Tracks and how you don't have to pull out a Columbia Records music player to listen to it, and how even without industry we would have games. And so I mean, I've seen those sorts of articles start to pop up about the arms race between whoever and whatever, and this system does this, and here's why they're already behind, and it all feels like I'm reading Nintendo Power still. I mean, I just wonder, like, what would you like to see, like, in an ideal world, or in a world that gives you a little bit more hope? Like, how would you like to see these sort of transitions of hardware be discussed differently, or even the way things like quote unquote generations, sort of challenged? Because obviously this one's a little bit different, because I think it took like 8-9 years, and obviously that's a recognition of, or an admission of something,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the current console generation also took about, I think it hit about 7, it hit in 2013 or so.
Yeah.
And then Nintendo is kind of,
trend, yeah.
doing the counter timing to that. But, I think, so, I mean, my vision of how the games console market should work is that these distinctions, maybe once upon a time, there were meaningful distinctions between hardware architectures and different approaches to proprietary technology design. But now all of the consoles are essentially the same chips. They're
even already getting dinged for like not playing well with others. So I feel like the lines are even blurring even further,
Yeah, I mean, what a console is basically is a commodified snapshot of PC hardware with a few special design considerations that allow it to sort of perform better in a dedicated fashion in some way. But it is basically, commodity. I mean, this generation and the next generation they're the same kinds of parts essentially that you would have in a computer. It's just that they are branded and tied to services and platform exclusives. And so when people talk about different console brands nowadays, that's really that's really all they're talking about. But it's sort of this. So the fact that like these journalists who don't really know much about technology are treating it, they want to create a horse race so that they can make a little bit of money reporting on it.
Right.
It's super destructive it's just bizarre coming from outside of this medium and looking in and being like, oh, well, if you really do want to understand the history of this medium, or you just want to kind of, be able to sample freely as you would like somebody who goes to the movies.
Right.
And doesn't think about which movie studio made something, it's absurd and tragic that our medium is balkanized across these platforms, when essentially the reason that the only differences between these platforms exist because of business protective interests. It's like, oh, well, yeah, we have our little, and again, it's upholding platform. Nowadays, the way that it's expressed is platforms. I'm sure that they think now of, a game console as a platform because it's sort of, it's talking about like, oh, all the software services around it and the fact that, and also the customer relationships. So like, yeah, you are, a PlayStation customer or whatever, and you have an account with them. They know what you're consuming and what you're up to on those platforms, and they control creators' access to that audience on that. So, yeah, and but at the end of the day, it's all x86 64 chips with a general purpose GPU that probably runs some little like low level hardware API that lets you make everything go fast. And with a new generation, like we're basically getting that same kind of thing, but with it's a snapshot of more recent technology. Yeah. Probably has an SSD for faster disk access and all that. And it's just I think this was starting to happen even like 15, 20 years ago. But I think now it's continued to pace, is just this idea of diminishing returns on like, wow, there's a whole new box that you have to get. And what does it do that's better and different? And are games better for it and all that sort of stuff?
Well, so, I mean... and then there's like these new sort of half-generation boxes that come out that are like marginally better for late adopter. Like, I don't know anybody who has a 4K TV.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, 4K itself is kind of a diminishing, is a product of diminishing returns. Because it's like, okay, well, it was obviously a pretty big jump from standard definition to high definition. And then they're like, well, this was great. Like TV manufacturers loved this transition. It was their lifeblood. And then consoles, I mean, the cost of the SD to HD transition was, if you really measure that cost in the fullest sense, the real cost of it was that almost the fundamental nature of our medium changed. A whole bunch of creators went out of business because in order to produce content for that higher fidelity platform, you need bigger teams and you need to do stuff at a much more industrial kind of scale and all that. And so there was this sort of, Triassic die-off kind of thing. And then the people that survive, and then there was a lot of consolidation around that, and some of the major publishers ultimately ended up going out of business generation before last, and so yeah, these cycles of like destruction, I think, from the standpoint of the platform holders, they are considered creative destruction because they allow them to like reinvent their markets and all that. But for everybody else, it's just this treadmill, offering increasingly marginal benefit.
Yeah.
So I think, so when I talk about like how I imagine it working, I mean, I think the fact that these are separate brands and platforms with no interoperability, other than a developer doing like a super expensive, labor-intensive port, I think I don't think there should be branded hardware platforms. I think, well, it's fine for it to be branded, but the fact that these are like different architecturally is just a complete waste. Like customers and developers are paying for platform holders' ability to compete with one another and kind of like, get their, like, wrangle their duopoly. I think what would be far better would be an open standard that, not a proprietary standard. People, like, anytime I talk about this publicly, people are like, "Oh, well, they tried that once with 3DO," as if like a single, very poorly conceived implementation of an idea back in the '90s is like the only necessary needed nail in the coffin for this entire idea.
Yeah.
But I think when I talked about it like 15 years ago, a lot of people thought I was crazy, and now it's like, well, yeah, geez, like these platforms are kind of the same, and like, gee, what if, the reason. I think, and so I can articulate like, well, yeah, if it was an open standard and it had like, every 5 years there was a generational bump, but there was total back compat, from each generation. So there wasn't like there's no divergence of specs or anything. It's basically like you own a 2015 or a 2020 console or a 2025 console, whatever it can, I think there's ways to do that. And I even think that there's ways that these companies could still, do their little capitalism thing and compete on features that fall outside of that standard and, offer their own services and stuff like that. And it's almost becoming at this point that the chips in the box don't even matter. Right. But anyway, I think, and I think also just like but these companies don't want to, the main reason that we can't have that reality that would be immeasurably better for both players and developers. Mm-hmm. The main reason that we can't have that is because of this proprietary, factionalism. And because they're like, oh, well, but no, we make the fact that people think our console is different and special, and that they, by extension, are different and special for owning one versus the other. That's our entire, that's how we make all of our money. The margin, we can have much higher margins on that. We can charge for access to our platform and all that. Mm-hmm. And that's just totally antithetical to what a healthy, reasonable creative medium would do. And I mean, I'm sure somebody in the music industry or the film industry could tell us all kinds of problems that they have with their medium. But at least those media, as mass media, those media got started in an era when capitalism hadn't just completely asserted and just perverted, contorted those forms into a specific shape. So I think that's what we need to be working back towards for. So we need to be
when people are not to cut you off, I think probably what you're about to say may tie into this, but when people are like, well, what about the 3DO? Like, I wonder, like, or I don't know, I don't remember if you were making the case for or against it, but like I don't understand how, like, this is in games, it's a field full of wildly creative and imaginative people, but there seems to be, as soon as you suggest things maybe be just like a click or two to the left or to the right, you just get a lot of fear and dismissiveness. And I guess like that's sort of my theory is like what drives a lot of that whataboutism. But it sounds like you've had some of that directed at yourself. Like, what do you feel is driving that when they're trying to shut you down? When it sounds like it would just be a more, rewarding, diverse, and interesting, and probably more accessible to people who aren't already used to this sort of stuff. It would actually not only break down the fourth wall, but maybe the third and the second, and just make this like a much more, I don't know, all my friends who think games are weird may not think that anymore then,
Yeah, I mean that's the dream. Yeah, I think we live in an era where we have these entities that have power on a scale that is literally incomprehensible to us humans.
Yeah.
These companies are basically gods in as far as the scale of power, despite the fact that they are made of people who make decisions and have values and all that. And so I think what happens when people dismiss the possibilities of broader change and even the obligation of systemic analysis, they're identified with that power. Most people end up finding security in this messed up world of corporations by identifying with some form of power. They're like, well, Nintendo, I trust Nintendo because they make these games that are kind of charming and well crafted, and I imprinted on them as a young child,
right.
And so they identify with that power, and they kind of, and when you do that, you kind of just import and accept the value system of that platform, of that company, and I think it does become, as you sort of alluded to, fish swimming in water and being like, what the hell is water? I think it becomes invisible. You don't even see that anymore. And so when somebody comes in and says, and I'm not trying to cast myself as some bold truth teller or anything. It's just like, well, just any kind of skeptical voice, or like, what if it was a different way?
Right.
I think people that threatens people's identification with that power, and they will act to quell that, basically. And that's why you have a bunch of people on Twitter defending billionaires and things like that. I think identification with power, and what might arguably be the connected phenomenon of Stockholm syndrome, I think is actually a super powerful force in human psychology, and I think it's very much at work in so then in the context of all that, you're a creative person trying to just do a little bit of labor, and this is the world that you live in, and even if you are skeptical of that power and you recognize the situations where it doesn't have your own interests at heart, you still kind of in order to do business, you end up having to throw in with a lot of these entities sometimes. And then, you're sort of complicit in some way. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, do I also then identify with that power? And, the thing that I think you definitely don't have to, you can, I don't think people should be, bear the full weight of their responsibility for just trying to exist in a society. When you talk about the gig economy being this awful, just ethical, holocaust, it's not because Uber drivers are bad people and they're supporting a bad company by taking part in it. They're just workers just trying to get some bread, Yeah. And so I think it's very important to direct that, to understand that, that all of us, developers and press and all that, we have solidarity and superior numbers against these companies. And what can we do with that? Both in the short term in terms of just changing our thinking and thinking differently about what's possible, and then long term about how we supplant and replace this and build a better world.
Yeah. Is that going to happen in our lifetime, you think? I hope so.
Well, I think even if there was a big dramatic sweep or anything, I think it would still kind of the historical record would probably still see it as being something that happens in stages.
Yeah.
I don't want to wait for some big grand dramatic revolution that completely sweeps away the past. I don't think that's likely to happen in a lot of capital-dominated fields, because capital ends up, is a lot more fluid and adaptable than any single governmental or whatever power structure.
Right.
So I think it's more just about, the eyes on the prize is not big, dramatic, overnight change. I think it's just steady erosion of the things that we know are corrosive to human values, and building, and building alternatives that grow stronger year by year. Yeah. I think that's another way to track that progress. If I need hope, I try to look at what are people building right now that is helping us get to that better world, even in some tiny way, and can I be involved with that? Can I participate in it? What could I make that would help make that a little better?
Yeah, that actually hooks in with something else that you had mentioned, which is that you have this long-term hope for games to sort of become a basic human practice, like making music or painting. And I guess I understood you were talking about an erosion of the barriers to entry just to create. And you mentioned tracking progress. That's actually literally the question I had here is how are you tracking progress on that hope?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that is difficult to measure, despite being of immense value to society and all that. Because how do you measure the value of hope? How do you measure the strength of a given community? You can't really put a dollar value on that, especially when it's starting its life as a non-profit, as a non-commercial platform or something. But yeah, I mean, I do think, something that I think has been very, even though there was this whole indie gold rush kind of thing, and it ended up, mostly just making money for the platform holders. Yeah. I do think that the flowering of the medium as via indie games and just all those, I definitely don't want to just describe it as a commercial phenomenon, because I do think it was, from about 2005 into the present day, I do think there has been a large influx of new voices and new creative disciplines in games. I think a lot of people, and an easy example is Twine, which, was a relatively simple tool to put together, but it was able to open a door into this medium for a lot of people who, maybe played games, maybe didn't, understood interactivity and had something that they wanted to do with interactivity that they couldn't do with just writing a short story or something. And so that tool ended up creating a bridge into our medium from, a bunch of other fields that the author of that tool and the rest of us couldn't have conceived of. I mean, the whole point in these potentialities is that you don't know just how big they're going to get. But so I think, looking at communities that develop around particular aesthetics, around particular tools, around particular, just in communities hey, South American game devs, this sort of has its own baggage, but the queer games scene of 7 or 8 years ago that was sort of reported on as this discrete entity, even though it was a sort of much more diffuse movement. And, I think looking at the vibrancy of different creative communities and seeing what directions they're pushing in and where people are coming and going to within communities, I think that's important to look at. And that's something that I think journalists can play a really valuable role just by covering the scene of Russian Doom Doom mod creators. What are they doing? What have they done in the past year? What's going on in that community? And I think some of these communities are, diffuse to the point of, being a little difficult to report on as a discrete entity. But nevertheless, I would love it if there were a bunch of different scene reporters, just talking about all these different interesting little things. And I sort of stumbled to name discrete movements because I know that there's so many of them out there, but we don't necessarily hear about them in a top-down way. But I think, if you look at other media, though, there are absolutely the Detroit industrial scene of the late 80s. There are these discrete moments in time, and and then in 19th and 20th century art movements, they had this locality to them in time, if not in space, where people were interested in particular ideas and aesthetics. And I think those are important, and I think, we now have a little bit of consciousness about different art movements within games, or just movements, and I think, that's something, that's what a healthy medium does, is that it, it passes around to a bunch of different people and becomes all these different things.
Yeah, I mean, you mention it, and then I get all excited. It's oh yeah, I would love to read about stuff like that. And then I think well, who would even run something like that, or who even has the budget for something like that? Because it's similar to what you were talking about with just rethinking relationship with the hardware. That's the thing that writers are often up against, is there's this hardware built of the way we've always done things, or just sort of, or it's not even that. It's just, it's governed by how overworked an editor it is, and whether they see the email.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, I am sympathetic. Like, just as I don't want to blame an Uber driver for the, for the ethics of its employer. I definitely understand. Like, yeah, I have an old friend who works in journalism, and like I've just known enough journalists to know that, like, yeah, they are feeling a lot of the same precarity and pressures that creators are, and that there's really very little difference. So yeah, I think I think specifically with regards to reporting on small movements and little cultural moments and communities and stuff, I think that's something where, communities historically, often people within those are compelled to report on things themselves.
Right.
And that's how you get stuff like zines, where it's like, yeah, I'm in Peoria, Illinois in like the early 90s, and I'm into the punk scene there, and I made a zine about it. And now, like 20 years later, we have this document of that just nobody was going to, there's no money in that, but it's an important little, snapshot of a culture that, ultimately is part of a continuity of a medium and human experience.
Yeah, I think sometimes when thinking about these things, especially when you look over at another lane, like you were talking about with like, even about zines or even about these things based in locality, and like it's weird to think like, well, why don't we hear more about those things in games? And I think, like I said, like there are just like these weird hiccups from time to time where at least I kind of just go back on the realization that like we're still in like a kind of young medium, even though it's been around for some of us for our entire lives, or we sort of grew up with it. But there are these weird disparities, and I don't know if that's why there's like still this perception. Like I know you laughed when I said about like friends thinking games are weird. Like I don't know if that like is a contributor to like why games are still seen as weird because they haven't crossed those particular bridges, or I don't know. It just becomes very dissonant in my mind, where it's like you can see these things, you can see the need for these things. It seems very straightforward and right in front of us, and yet you try to describe it to someone else and they think you're insane.
Oh no, I absolutely see it, and yeah, I think like how outsiders, people who have never played a game and don't really think about games, I think how those folks see this medium from the outside is an important, not the only, but it is an important bellwether of like how we're doing and what needs to change. And I do think it, compared to other media, this medium has had, I don't know if I would call it a young medium at this point, because it is about, it's over 50 years old by most definitions. But I think one thing that's definitely true of it compared to a lot of other forms is that it was born into industrial capitalism, whereas, film was getting started right around, the emergence of that. And certainly early film history was kind of about this ruthless protectionism by the patent holders and all that. But like, it wasn't quite on the same industrial scale. And recorded music may be similar, but obviously music goes, way back into human prehistory. But yeah, I think another important thing regarding like the video games or a young medium thing, I think it is frequently useful to think of anything that you do, but certainly games, as being part of a longer tradition, because before digital games, we had analog games. And yes, there's a lot of different like formal qualities and all that. But I think treating that continuity as a source of depth and value, and looking for ways to make that matter, I think that's good and important, because then it's sort of like, it just gives you a broader historical context. The more you're thinking about history and the different modes that society has dealt with this thing in, I think the better equipped you are to do the kind of systemic analysis that's needed to like imagine and build the future. I do think that all of this weird stuff that we've been talking about does result in people not quite knowing how to get into games, because it's split across platforms weirdly, and it's technologically mediated, and just all these things.
Yeah. Well, you were talking a bit about media stuff, and I'm glad actually that you mentioned in your email that you think about these kinds of things, because I just as far as like just words that stick out to you, and you had a point of friction with the word fun, which you just said you were just so tired of hearing as sort of I don't know, among game developers, or as like a governor of power of some sort and some dynamics. I'm just sort of curious to hear, like, when did fun start bothering you, and what have you noticed about the way that people use it?
Sure. Yeah, I think as far as when it started bothering me, I think it's like in the 2000s, in the aughts, when I started thinking critically about this medium, and I started having experiences with it that were diverse and compelling enough that I was like, oh yeah, this experience that I just had, I wouldn't say that it was fun. Like, fun doesn't feel like a very appropriate word to just, because maybe it like horrified me, or, really put me into this very meditative kind of state, or it made me think about my own life in this very reflective kind of way. I mean, I think those experiences have existed. Those aren't a new thing. People have been making those kinds of experiences for as long as they've been making digital games.
Yeah.
And so just thinking about like what our vocabulary is, I think the vocabulary that game designers use to think about their own work and to do, sort of analysis of their peers' work, I think has a huge impact on what you think games can do and what games should do. And so when I hear game designers who just sort of like, oh yeah, man, it's all about fun. You just got to make it fun. Oh, I don't think this is fun yet. And so first of all, I have a few problems with it. Just within the scope of a craft discussion, when we're talking about like how to improve something, fun is just like, it's just this non-existent, it's like useless and vague to the point. It's just this mayonnaise word, and I just hate it. And then like, yeah. And then as far as like, okay, well, how, say you switch to sort of like a word that more broadly, that's still vague, but it's sort of, like compelling or something. Yeah. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, that is a word that I prefer. It's more syllables, and it doesn't, but like compelling, because yeah, like the full gamut of this medium, is, I want to, I would say it's compelling work. Fun is sort of like this subset, and it is a very appealing, it's how a lot of people's first experiences playing a game is playing a fun game. They put a quarter into Pac-Man back in the day. They, installed a little match 3 on their mobile phone or whatever. And I think, so yeah, I'm definitely not against people making experiences that one could. It's pathetic that I even have to like offer this caveat, honestly, and it sort of goes to show like how much power that word has. But I think it's like, yeah, like I think, in my email to you, I think I likened fun to danceability in music.
Yeah, you did.
Like, yeah, there's a lot of types of music that you can dance to, and you can immediately see, just as a human, why that is compelling and good. And it's like, cool, yeah, nobody wants danceable music to go away, probably, unless you're a weird supervillain or something. But there's sort of like, I think within a given, like electronic music was sort of like this. I mean, electronic music started off as this totally experimental thing, and then it became about danceability. And then there have been like multiple, I think every medium goes through these like convulsions where it's like, it has this idea that makes it more broadly appealing. And then it's like, oh wait, is this the essence of this medium? Is fun the most fundamental quality of games? And what people are responding to frequently there is just like popularity. They're like, oh, this really fun game got really popular. Is it the game? Is it like the most game? Is it the most gamey game there is? And it's like, well, every train of thought that leads in that direction is just reductive, and it leads to sort of all of this other compelling kind of work disappearing from our imaginations effectively. So, and why would you choose to like live in that world,
Yeah.
I mean, I think, yeah. So, I think a lot of times when people focus on fun, they're responding to capital pressures. They're like, oh, but we have to make a game that will sell. And so we need to make it fun because fun stuff sells. And it's like, oh my gosh, I feel so sorry for people who just, who can't kick out any of the walls of that box because, I mean, yeah, like it doesn't, you could do that. And it's a yes and type situation. You can do something that's fun. And even within a work that has like tragic themes and like, gets into all these aspects of human experience, you can still have things that are fun. So it's just this tiny subset of what this medium can do. It's just the one that was sort of anointed by capitalism at the beginning of it.
Right.
So I think it's we've grown far beyond it, and people acting like we haven't is just sort of weird and sad.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that it does reinforce those structures that you were talking about in the duopoly, which I guess I don't know if that excludes Nintendo or whatever, but the point is like that there are these three entities that they can sort of be pointed to and be like, oh, well, this is, they make what video games actually are. Don't you see how fun they are? And I think it's easy to forget that there used to be a time when no one was really quite sure what a video game should be. And then, in fact, like, when you open yourself up to those different sorts of discoveries, then I think actually that may be what fun is rather than, like, just sticking to familiar comfort food that we keep getting served.
Yeah, totally. It's definitely a mac and cheese kind of thing, and yeah, right. The fact that there are three companies that are just pumping out the mac and cheese. Now, I think even those companies have kind of realized. I think they have admitted and figured out how to profit from the gradual broadening. Because if you look at like say Sony, a lot of their like franchises that they notionally own and whatever, I think they've understood that like if you have something like Last of Us that is like that feels like kind of a serious TV drama kind of thing, so I think those companies probably see it as like they've been able to expand this notion of fun to include things that are fun more in the way that like a Marvel movie where a character dies can be fun.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, it was sad when this character died, but then I got to like shoot the zombies that killed him, and that was fun. And it's just sort of, but it's ultimately kind of like it's not thinking very coherently in terms of like values or like artistry, or it's doing so only within a very narrow remit. So yeah.
I don't usually get into things like this, but I did interview Neil Druckmann a few years ago, and I mean, that's sort of my perception is that his studio is sort of seen as the standard bearers for, what qualifies as like quote unquote mature storytelling in games. And I remember asking him, are they sort of aware of this reputation, which of course he was. And I asked him like, well, why is it then that in so many of your games, like, are we still just doing the same things, just jumping, shooting, and killing? And he just sort of, I mean, I don't know, he sort of laughed because he said he hadn't really thought about it, and he just said that, like, really, at the heart of it, like, he couldn't think of anything more exciting that we could give players to do other than doing those things. And that has stuck with me, I guess, because I feel like it's insightful, but it's also kind of disappointing personally. And then I think, similarly, we were talking before, it's like, well, if you are in a position of power, like, I guess they're pushing stuff forward in some regards, but I wish, at least on a surface level, it was it looked a little different, But that's just me, in my opinion, and I'm not saying they should be doing something other than what they're doing. But you so rarely hear from people like that who are controlling those things about why the things they make are the way that they are.
Yeah, it's super disappointing. I mean, it's depressing, and it's disappointing to hear someone say that they hadn't even thought about it. Because if you have a full sense of what your medium can do, and you decide to do something that's like, yeah, this is crowd pleasing, and it's kind of and it works,
Yeah.
But I do think that, the big elephant in the room there is just the sort of standardization on a tiny number of conflict-based game mechanics.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really just about conservatism and the industry's inability to do R&D, because I think if the industry had a really different perspective on R&D, and there would certainly be, there would be a lot of super narrative driven things where you don't pick up a gun or shoot anything or jump over anything.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that people haven't done that kind of work. I mean, I think BioWare, and Telltale, have carved out a space where it's like, yeah, cool. Like, this game is mostly about story, but I think they're also not doing that in an especially experimental context. They're basically like pushing ahead with the sort of graphic adventure dialogue tree kind of stuff. Say nothing. Like, I do think that those companies have genuinely, pushed those directions further along, to great effect in a lot of cases. But I think fundamentally there is a set of core mechanics that are not risky to do. Like, you're not going to get fired if you're if you're the head of a AAA project and you say, our character can jump, they can shoot, and they can do melee attacks on dudes, and the game action is largely going to be about that. Right. Because there's like, and I also want to be careful here because it takes immense amounts of work to make those things good to modern standards of quality. But at the same time, you're kind of like, it's a local maximum. It's the tallest hill, but if we can in the area, and we can see these mountains off in the distance that we're pretty sure are like as tall or taller, but like we would have to cross through so many rivers and valleys and so forth that like it would bankrupt us to have to try to do that. And so we're going to sit on this hill that we know is like works very well, and that's good enough for us. And I think that's basically what you get when you have a medium that is as driven by capital as this is, and even in other forms, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what R&D looks like in, fields that don't do anything in the way of like software engineering.
Yeah.
But I think it should be treated, and that's one of the reasons that, the wave that happened, around 2005, 2008, 2010, whatever, was positive is because a whole bunch of creators were coming in working at a dramatically different scale. They had no choice they couldn't compete on fidelity and production values. So they had to just try out different ideas. And in a lot of cases, those were things that we already knew worked from previous generations of games. But in some cases, it was like, well, yeah, I'm going to make a narrative experience because I can't put gunplay in this game. And what does that let us do? And so I think independent games in a lot of respects ended up serving as kind of an R&D lab that, AAA was able to capitalize on in some respects, because, anyway, yeah.
That never made any sense to me, by the way, because it was always, let's have the people with the least money take the most risk.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That is absolutely, and yeah.
I mean, it makes kind of sense, but it makes no sense.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's not, it's the opposite of the just distribution of resources and stuff.
Right.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's generally that is also an attribute of platforms is that they outsource risk. The risk is the Uber driver driving their own car, and if they get in an accident, then that's on that's on them. And it's so if a developer makes an unconventional a game with unconventional mechanics or unconventional themes, and it doesn't do well, or they get abused by sort of like the cultural conservative guard of within video games, then effectively these companies, these bigger companies, have outsourced that to them, and then years later they can be like, oh well, yeah, cool, we also can have a gay protagonist or whatever, yeah.
All right. Well, I have just one last question for you, unless something popped up for you that you wanted to mention and I didn't give you a chance to.
Sure.
Sure. So just this is a big one and a broad one. What have video games accomplished?
What have video games accomplished? I think that they've shown that when you can interact with art in weird, deeply structural ways, then you have a new medium, which even that is not as impressive as its potential to sort of just create a different, equally but differently meaningful mode of human thought and experience. Because when you're interacting with something, I think it changes the way that you engage with ideas. It can make certain kinds of experiences real to you in a way that other media can't. And also it is a multi-medium. It can integrate, all these other media. It can integrate music and video and 3D architecture and 2D graphic design. And so I think it's basically one of the ways in which digital technology does help excavate new features of human potential and helps us understand ourselves a little better and helps us communicate, and ideally it will help bring us closer together and understand each other and build a more just society. And those are really the stakes, I guess, when I talk about who's in charge at the moment and how to get out from under that. But I do think that is an accomplishment, and just I imprinted on this silly medium almost before I could speak. So I've just kind of grown up with it inside of me and all around me. But I do think that's a broad enough remit, same as any other creative medium, that you can build a life working within that, and fighting for, what you think is right in it. I don't know. Yeah. But I'm pretty interested in what, a lot of other people have to say on that as well. So yeah, it's definitely a good one to end with.